In the last lecture, I gave the truth table for arrow, but that truth table actually has some fairly strange consequences that we need to discuss. So the conditional that arrow is used to symbolize, the kind of conditional that we deal with in propositional logic, is known as a material conditional. Now, when I first introduced our logical symbols, I told you that we would use arrow to symbolize English indicative conditionals. Now, I think that English indicative conditionals are, in fact, material conditionals, but this is extremely controversial. There are some philosophers who think that I would be corrupting your young minds by telling you that this is the case. So I want to go over that controversy just a little bit. So there are various paradoxes associated with material conditionals, and these paradoxes arise from the following two facts. First, it is sufficient for any material conditional to be true that its antecedent be false. So, for example, since it is false that the moon is made of cheese, it is true that if the moon is made of cheese, then the president is a space alien. At least that is true if we read this conditional as a material conditional. Likewise, it is sufficient for any material conditional to be true that its consequent be true. So, for example, since it is true, I presume, that the president is not a space alien, it is also true that if a space alien infiltration is well underway, the president is not a space alien. But that seems bizarre. It seems bizarre to think that that conditional is true. So, to repeat, it is sufficient for any material conditional to be true that its antecedent be false, and it's also sufficient for any material conditional to be true that its consequent be true. Inspect the truth table and you will see that that is so. This arises from the fact that the only case in which the material conditional is false is when it has a true antecedent but a false consequent. In every other case, it is true. Okay, so let me tell you why I think that material conditionals, the kind of conditionals that we study in propositional logic, really are English indicative conditionals. So I gave you an argument for the conclusion that if A then B is true, when and only when it is not the case that A and not B is true. And when I gave you that argument, I gave it to you in English, treating if A then B as if what it represented was an English indicative conditional. The argument appeared for all the world to be sound when I gave it in that way. So it is the burden of anyone who denies that the English indicative conditionals are material conditionals to tell us just where that argument goes wrong. At least to tell us just where that argument goes wrong if the conditionals it employs are understood as English indicative conditionals. But I think if you look over that argument, that's a very difficult thing to do. The argument appears for all the world to be sound if we understand the conditionals at issue as English indicative conditionals. Okay, also, the inference rules that we've employed in our system up to this point tell us that the following sequent, and hence every substitution instance of that sequent, is valid. P arrow Q, double turnstile, not P or Q. This is just one of our rules for material conditionals. But what this sequent tells us directly is that when a material conditional of the form if P then Q is true, it is true when and only when not P or Q is true. That is, this sequent tells us that a material conditional of the form if P then Q is true, just in case either P is false or Q is true. That is, either when its antecedent is false or its consequent is true. So this tells us just what we thought, or just what I just said is the case concerning material conditionals. That it's sufficient for a material conditional to be true that its antecedent be false or that its consequent be true. Okay, but we derive this sequent using the primitive rules in our system. rules that seem self-evidently valid for English indicative conditionals. When I introduced all those rules that we learned in the last chapter, they all seemed self-evidently valid. But if those rules are valid, and the kind of conditionals that we were testing them against were ordinary English indicative conditionals, which for all the world they appeared to be, then this sequent is valid, and this sequent tells us that the truth conditions for conditionals are those that we've assigned to the material conditional. So it is the burden of anyone who would deny that English indicative conditionals are material conditionals to tell us just which of our primitive rules is invalid if understood to apply to English indicative conditionals. Good luck with that. I don't think that that is an easy thing to do. Okay, so that's why I believe that material conditionals are in fact English indicative conditionals. But, as I said, this is controversial, and part of the controversy stems from the fact that there are all these paradoxes associated with thinking of English indicative conditionals as material conditionals. So here is one such paradox. I just said that it is true that if the moon is made of cheese, the president is a space alien. But that seems like the sort of thing only a lunatic would say. So the right conclusion to draw, I put a question mark here, this is the right conclusion to draw according to people who deny that material conditionals are indicative conditionals. They would say, since true things aren't crazy to say, it must be the case that if this conditional is true, it is not an ordinary English conditional, but some sort of weird conditional that is only used in logic. At least that's what some people would say. Well, here is my rebuttal. Why think there aren't true things that would nonetheless be crazy to say? There are the things that it's not crazy to say. There are the things that it's true. But why not think that among the true things, some of them would be crazy to say? It also seems crazy to say, for example, that either the moon is not made of cheese or the president is a space alien. But I think if we think carefully about the meaning of the inclusive or in English, we can still see that this is a true thing to say. So an inclusive or is true just in case an inclusive or is true just in case at least one of its disjuncts is true. Well, the moon is not made of cheese, so that disjunct is true. And since the moon is not made of cheese, it follows that the moon is not made of cheese or the president is a space alien. That's a crazy thing to say, but I think our linguistic competence with or tells us that even though it's a crazy thing to say, it's true. So I don't think that this is a good reason to deny that material conditionals are in fact English indicative conditionals. Okay, paradox number 2, crazy inferences. Consider the following inference. It is not the case that the moon is made of cheese. Therefore, if the moon is made of cheese, the president is a space alien. This inference is valid if we understand the conditional at issue as a material conditional, but it seems crazy to think that this inference is valid if we think of this conditional as an ordinary conditional. At least that's what someone who thinks that material conditionals are not ordinary indicative conditionals might say. Okay, well, my rebuttal to this is that this may not be an inference that we would typically make using indicative conditionals. It's not the sort of inference that we would have occasion to make in ordinary life. But that doesn't really tell us very much about whether or not this inference is valid. There are lots of valid inferences that we would never draw in ordinary life, but they're nonetheless valid. So I'm not particularly convinced by this argument either. Okay, this paradox is a little bit more troublesome. It is true that the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, was a Democrat. You can trust me on that. I looked it up on Wikipedia. So, Given this and our account of the truth conditions for material conditionals, it follows that the following material conditional is true. If the 39th President of the United States was a Republican, the 39th President of the United States was a Democrat. That follows because it's true that the 39th President of the United States was a Democrat. So this conditional has a true consequent. So the whole conditional, understood as a material conditional, is true, regardless of what the antecedent says. Okay, but if we read this conditional as an indicative conditional, the above doesn't seem crazy, it seems false. If you didn't know who the 39th President of the United States was, and I said if the 39th President of the United States was a Republican, the 39th President of the United States was a Democrat, you would think not only that I had said something crazy, but that I had said something false. And yet, I claim that, as a matter of fact, this conditional is true. So how can this paradox be explained? Well, we need to make a distinction, I think, between which claims are assertable and which claims are true. So some statements are true, but in certain contexts at least, not assertable. So here's an example. Suppose that Jones, a student of mine, asked me to serve as a reference for a prospective employer. The prospective employer calls me on the phone and asks me whether Jones, who in fact faithfully showed up to class and was always on time, is punctual. I say, let me tell you something about Jones. Jones has beautiful handwriting. Okay, well, it may well be true that what I say in that particular context is true. It may in fact be the case that Jones has beautiful handwriting. But what I say in that context is totally inappropriate. And it's inappropriate for a couple of reasons. So one reason that it's inappropriate is it's not an answer to the question that was asked. I wasn't asked about Jones's handwriting, I was asked about Jones's punctuality, and I didn't answer that question. So what I said was inappropriate. But another reason that saying it is inappropriate in that context is because by saying it, even if it's true, by saying it in that context, I actually suggest something false. Namely, I suggest that Jones is not punctual and that I'm just looking for something else nice about him to say. So even though that statement is true in that context, it's not assertable. Okay, well, when it comes to indicative conditionals in English, often we assert an indicative conditional in English when we think that the consequent of that conditional is highly probable on the assumption that its antecedent is true. Those are often the conditions in which we'll assert an indicative conditional. So, for example, I will assert that if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, someone else did, because I believe that it's highly probable on the assumption that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy that someone else did. So I'm willing to assert that conditional. Now, I personally believe that Oswald did shoot Kennedy, and I believe that indicative conditionals are material conditionals. So I also believe that it is true that if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, no one did. I think that's true, but this wouldn't be an appropriate thing for me to say in most ordinary contexts. If I said this in an ordinary context, it would suggest that I had the crazy view that even though we all know that it is a fact of history that Kennedy is shot, or was shot, it is probable on the assumption that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy that no one did. But I don't believe that. That would be a crazy thing to believe. So I wouldn't assert this conditional. Okay, but this has to do with the conditions under which these conditionals are appropriate to say, not the conditions under which they are true. So here's my suggestion. English indicative conditionals really are material conditionals. But the ones that seem false, in spite of the fact that our truth conditions say otherwise, often seem that way because they wouldn't be appropriate to assert in ordinary contexts, not because they're not really true. So it seems false, for example, that if the 39th president was a Republican, the 39th president was a Democrat. I say, not because this conditional really is false, because it would, under almost any ordinary circumstance, be inappropriate to say. And that explains away why it seems to be false, in spite of the fact that I think it is true.